Greenleaf and the Black Blade, a serialized adventure podcast by Andrew Israelson. Episode 10, The Wrath of Johannes Bruckner. After considering their next steps, Nima and Bruckner judged it wise to get some rest in advance of the upcoming night, which promised to be eventful. Nima suggested that they take Chesler back to their rooms at the Hidden Hawk Inn, but Bruckner countered that they may draw suspicion to themselves there, suggesting they instead hide him away in a seedier location and a poorer quarter farther from the town center. The two took Chesler to an area of town near the courthouse towards the north end of the city, to a small inn called the Bearded Wanderer that lay nestled between a stinking butcher shop and a dilapidated apothecary. It was a small and lackluster place run by a thin, careworn man with a weary-looking wife and two small children. The service was prompt and courteous, but the fare was nothing impressive. They rented the trio a room for the night, not batting an eye at the rather strange request of one room for 3 people, for 1 silver piece, and seemed grateful that the guests made no attempt at bartering. They took Chesler up to the room and sat down to wait until nightfall, Nima and Bruckner taking turns dozing on the room's single bed. The dark set in at about 8:30 o'clock. Chesler spent the time sitting and fidgeting, scratching, looking at his fingernails, occasionally standing and pacing. When they weren't resting, Nima and Bruckner discussed the plan in Tevianite so that Chesler could not understand them. Once the sun had fully set, Nima turned to Chesler and in the common tongue told him to get out of town fast. To emphasize the point, Bruckner, or Ted as Chesler knew him, drew his dirk very suddenly as Chesler was standing to make a hasty exit. Shoving the whimpering cultist against the wall, Bruckner slammed the knife blade into a heavy beam a mere inch from the side of Chesler's face.
"If you make me chase you, I will take you apart. Slowly. Is that all right with you?"
Chesler went so white that Nima feared he would faint dead away, but he managed to nod.
Yes, sir,"
he croaked. Bruckner stepped back, ripping the blade from the wall, and nodded in disgust. Chesler ran down the hall like a knock-kneed wind. The two watched from the window as he headed north, and kept an eye on him until he was well out of the town gates, to ensure he wouldn't circle back to warn the others. The two heroes prepared for battle. Each quaffed a potion of Armor of Moonlight, protection from Vanderil purchased at Lyle's Emporium. Tadalak had personally inspected the draughts and had declared them to be very pure and of quality brewing. They headed toward the courthouse, where the prison holding Janessin was located. It appeared they had arrived a bit earlier than the majority of the walkers. They noticed a few strands of cloaked people clustered in small knots, dispersed and few enough to avoid outright suspicion, but enough to raise the brows of any perceptive eyes. Sentries stood watch in front of the courthouse prison, but they either did not suspect anything yet, or more like, Aleksander had already cautioned them against appearing too wary, the better to draw the cultists in. After about 10 minutes, the area around the street was filled with silent individuals, draped in cloth darker than the night. Nima and Bruckner each had to admit that it was quite impressive how silently and quickly they managed to array themselves in a perimeter around the state building. Suddenly Nima heard a voice at her side. The masked man called Malik was standing beside her.
"Now is our moment,"
he whispered, his voice as dark and unfathomable as ever. The two also beheld Decludo, draped in an oddly shaped cloak of black, half floating, half balancing on malformed limbs, like a nightmare, and the giant, smiling figure also covered, waiting silently near him.
"Where's the fool, Chesler?"
Ted had to be rather vigorous with him. The man showed us a surprising urge to live. Unfortunately, he is no longer with us, but it is no matter. I have some fabricated documents that I have kept in case of such a contingency. They will be found upon certain of our members who fall during the conflict.
Malik turned sharply at the news of Chesler's death, then said,
"Unfortunate. He was weak, but your man should have shown more restraint."
He seemed angry, then it appeared to pass.
"It is just as well. The man was such a fool that he may have been more danger than good to us in Aleksander's hands, enchantment or no. The very stupid can find a way to thwart even powerful magics."
What you say is true,
Nima agreed wisely. Bruckner, meanwhile, casually stepped back 5 feet to ensure that the group of walkers were all roughly in front of him, the nearest members safely within sword's reach, and none behind him for a possible ambush.
Malik spoke, saying, "The iron is hot. The moment is now."
He pulled a small metal contraption from inside his cloak. It was a tiny copper tube with some twisting springs and a small lever jutting out from one side.
"Light of the void, guide us!"
he yelled suddenly, holding the canister up and depressing the lever. plume of violet flame erupted upward from the small device, casting the area around the courthouse into a noonday blaze, and all of the cloaked figures in the area swarmed, almost as a single body, towards the building, as they erupted like an onslaught of shadowy fire. A series of shouts rose up from the sides and roof of the courthouse. A contingent of archers stood up atop the building, firing a volley of arrows into the oncoming walkers. Several dropped, screaming as the arrows found their marks.
After the volley, swarms of Bastoran and Eltsilician troops erupted from the wings of the courthouse exterior, among them a little blonde gnome who sent a massive fireball whirling from a tiny fingertip to crash into the midst of the oncoming cultists. As the light flashed, Nima grabbed Bruckner's hand and the two fled through a crush of onrushing walkers to skid to a stop behind a tall column of stone. They exchanged nods, ripping their cloaks off and ridding their disguises, wearing their own faces once again. Then they turned to fight, for there was much blood that demanded shedding. Bruckner whirled out from behind the column, a single purpose filling his mind: to find and destroy the monstrosity known as Decludo. He saw the creature, now alone at the northern edge of the courtyard, half hidden in shadow where the torchlight fell but dimly. It was shedding its ill-fitting cloak, stretching forth as many scabrous and chitin-covered limbs, and shaking a great wash of spittle and phlegm from a dozen jabbering mouths. The sight of the creature filled Bruckner, as it had before, with rage beyond words, and he vowed silently within himself as he drew his black sword that this thing would not exist to see another sunrise through any of its many eyes. The battle was now raging in earnest, the general's men emerging from shadowy doorways or rappelling down ropes tied to the courthouse's flagpoles and battlements. The walkers were all rushing toward the prison now, some crying out in dismay as the armed soldiers appeared, and several turning to flee back the way they had come. More were cut down by arrows, and many among the press rushed forward, engaging with the soldiers. 3 of Aleksander's men dropped from spear wounds, and a 4th with a crossbow bolt through his left eye. Nima whirled from the column, looking for a target, and caught a glimpse of another soldier beginning to melt, screaming as a spray of magical acid erupted from whirling hands within a dark cloak. Beyond, she spied a cluster of walkers racing toward Tadalak, and the knot of soldiers about him. She activated the ring of secret spaces that Tadalak had enchanted for her, and once again inhaled, in shock as the world honeycombed around her. An arrow from one of the soldiers stabbed one of the group heading towards their position, dropping him to a knee. Nima stepped through a non-space and emerged right behind him, plunging her dagger into the back of his neck and severing the brainstem. He dropped dead from her blade as Tadalak called out, "Nice shortcut, little sister!" before summoning a shield of moonlight before a soldier to his right. The silvery disc of magic sending an arrow aimed at the man skittering harmlessly to the ground. Aleksander's troops were pushing back against the violence unleashed by the walkers, now responding in kind, rallying forward, and engaging with the cultic freaks. Nima saw 6 walkers impaled on severing steel, and then 3 more brought down roughly to the ground and dragged toward the courthouse doorway, to be taken alive for interrogation. Tadalak cast a spell of giantism on a large Severan soldier, who Nima suddenly recognized as Toro. He grew 8 feet in an instant, and his now even more massive greatsword scattered 5 walkers in one great swipe, dropping 3 of them stone dead. Just beyond the rim of firelight, Decludo, still partially draped under its heavy black cloak, spun violently, throwing the garment into the air and letting out a series of blood-chilling shrieks as the cloak went flying. Its protuberant eyes were wide and bloodshot, its many fingers grasping and reaching like tendrils of unholy energy, twisting and black-tipped phalanges seeking new flesh to add to its bulk. He made to careen forward toward the main body of the fight, but Bruckner stepped before him, his obsidian weapon held gleaming like a ray of dark death. Decludo grinned with many mouths and watched the youth, and licked his many lips and nodded its many heads, and then it made its way to the youth in a lumbering, shuffling, rolling leap. Meanwhile, the battle was intensifying before the courthouse doors. Nima snuck behind a wedge of Eltsilician spearmen as a cabal of cultists came on, scimitars and crossbows emerging from inky cloaked depths.
The walkers were dealing death about them, though Alexander's men were giving better than they got. 4 Bastoran swordsmen swarmed a massive cultist with a wicked metal club who had dropped several of their comrades. The large walker was bleeding from several wounds. With a feral cry, he threw his club away into the face of one of the flanking soldiers and reached inside his cloak. Suddenly, a deafening blast rocked the courtyard, accompanied with a blinding flash of light. Cobblestones and limbs sprayed in all directions, and when Nima's eyes readjusted, she could see a smoking crater where the man and his assailants had stood. Into her line of sight now came sprinting the tall, smiling, hooded creature, racing toward the fight with great galloping strides, and suddenly the robes on its back burst out in an explosion of shredded cloth. Underneath was a very tall, beaked humanoid with wild, bulbous eyes and rows of jagged teeth grimacing yellow from its angular mouth. The thing was covered in layers of chain, all tipped with razor-sharp triangular blades on the ends. The creature began whirling the chains about itself wildly, the lengths of frenzied death leaping outward, impaling 2 men on their lengths. A third metal cable whirred over Nima's head. She teleported to the roof of a small pavilion that stood in the courtyard center as the lengths of chain began to dance like prehensile limbs, striking out with seeming malice at the soldiers about them. Nima set a bolt to her crossbow and sent it whirring into the chain man's thigh. He screeched like the caw of a monstrous bird, his beady eyes finding her darker silhouette atop the gazebo roof. She cursed into Venet as 2 chains, tipped with slavering, breaching, clawing blades of animate force and tangible hunger, sped up towards her through the inky night.